This video is going to be on migrating a database application from MySQL to Postgres. The application I'm going to migrate is this simple warehouse management system that I've coded to provide pallet label printing and dispatch and some EDI functionality for a client. And this is going to show the process of changing from MySQL to Postgres with some of the gotchas, but not all of them. But I hope this is useful. So to get started, we're using a Docker environment here. So we've got heaps of different containers. We've got a MySQL container, and what we need to do is provide firstly our source environment. We've got that there with the MySQL. Let's connect to that with a GUI editor, and we can see that on this Docker container that the MySQL server is published on an external port 714. So this connection's already set up, and if we have a look, we've got a database here with heaps of tables in it with data in those tables. So what we now need to do is provide ourselves with a target to aim at as far as Postgres goes. Now to do that, we can modify our Docker Compose YAML file. So in our Docker Compose YAML, we see each Docker container is specified, but we don't currently have a Postgres one. So we're just going to copy and paste in that configuration, and we've got, just paste it next to the, and I think we can just do it like that, but it might need, that's good. Now the network specified for our MySQL container needs to be the same, so I'll just change that network there. And we also need to specify an environment variable for Docker Compose. So it's password, user, and DB, and a forward port. So going into our end file at the same level as Docker Compose, because Docker Compose uses this one, we just noticed that I've already created these particular variables. I'm just sharing the credentials with the MySQL database so they're all the same, and I have our Postgres port forwarding from 7017 to the outside world. So going back to our Docker Compose, we need to also add, we've got it, it's referencing a volume here, so I just need to make sure that that volume's specified in our volumes list, and that should be about right. Now let's bring that up, get into the correct yeah, there we are. So we now go Docker Compose up -d, and now it's starting that new container there. And if we have a look, we can see it's now running and publishing Postgres on 7017. Now using Postgres admin as a GUI, let's connect, and it might already be configured, so we just have to double check that it's working. And It's asking for a master password. And let's just see if we've got it already connected. We do. So if you were going to do that to register, you just choose the register option, give it a name, and then with the connection, we've created a database called dev on first container load here. So it's a blank database, and we can now work with this as the target for our migration. So we've got a schema already public defined here, but there's no tables in it. So we'll just see how it all works. But yeah, when we go into here, the connection is to localhost because we're developing on the same machine as our Postgres container. The port 7017, and because we're using the same credentials, dev, that is what we're using to connect to the server using password credentials. So this is just a default Postgres Docker container. Right, so now we need to do some sort of transfer between the MySQL environment and the environment for Postgres. To do that, I keep my Docker files in a configuration directory here, but we can create a maybe a folder and create a migration here. So we want to create a script that will run the migration with a particular product. So I might call that migrate sh. Now with this, we can do it a number of different ways, but one of the ways we can do it is using a Docker container that has the latest version of PGLoader on it. So we have this Docker container configured to connect to MySQL using these credentials currently, but let's just change those. And the source database is named dev as well, and the target database is also named dev. So we just need to make sure that the credentials are exactly the same. And we could, this in this terminal down the bottom here, this is actually the PHP container, and it using Debian, and we could run it from here. We'll go apt get install PGLoader. So we could use this to run the migration. And I believe that the version number here is 3.6.2. So that would probably be enough to run the migration with. But we're going to use the latest version of PGLoader as a Docker container and run it using that. So going to our terminal here, and we just change into our Docker folder and into Postgres migration, and we can just choose this here just to run our shell script. Now that's currently saying that the ports are not correct, database error, cannot connect. So we're using the IP address of the local computer here, And we could also change that, because we're on the terminal local computer, we could change that to localhost as well. And because we're on we're going to run it from a terminal on the local computer, but we need to specify the correct port numbers. So the MySQL port is 7014 and the Postgres port is 7017. So let's do that. 7014 and 7017 are the ports that we've created. So now run it again and let's see if it works. Okay, so that's not working, and there's a reason for that, because we're actually running it inside our WSL environment. So that's failed again. So notice within WSL it's this IP address. Will that work? Let's try it. And run it again. Right. So that does work. Now, if we run a terminal, just a Windows PowerShell terminal, and we do ipconfig and get it right, notice that our IP address is that. So we can choose to connect to the internal WSL port here, because we're running Docker using WSL. So that works. Or we can specify the IP address of the host computer running Windows, if you're running Windows, and that will work as well. But going back to here, we have an error message which says MySQL unsupported authentication was signaled. So what's causing that? If we have a look inside our MySQL container and we open a terminal and go into etc., and then just have a look at the MySQL configuration file, and we'll see that it's saying remove the leading hash to revert to previous value for default authentication plugin. So this value here is an old style of MySQL authentication, but PGLoader supports that but doesn't support the newer version. So what you need to do is to make a modification to this file here. Now I'm mounting my particular MySQL conf file using Docker, so I'm just going to go into here and remove that, save it, and then this may not work now, but let's try it. So go MySQL and choose restart, and it should work. Yep. So if we now have a look inside our terminal and just go etc., we should now see that the authentication plugin has now been changed. So now that that's been configured, let's try running our migration again. Let's have a look at that file and see what it's doing. So it's got basically a URL for each. And now let's have a look at it running. Let's try it and see if it works. Right, so it's successfully connected to the MySQL database and transferred all the information across to Postgres. Let's have a look at that in the Postgres GUI. And notice that it's created a schema name with the same name as the database name here. So it's dev database and dev schema as well. Now we can leave that the same. Let's now look at connecting to the Postgres database using our CakePHP application. Notice at the moment I'm passing in a host name here using this variable, and if we go up the top to where we source the variable or we create it, it's using an env command to pull an environment variable in. Now that is something that you might do when you're developing in CakePHP. In your Bootstrap PHP file, there's a block of code here that allows you to use php.env, and it says uncomment it, and then it will source the file that you specify, in this case config and the .env file, and then you can configure it to do whatever you'd like. And what that means is that you can specify all your variables in this .env file and make changes between environments, and when you're developing, it makes it very easy. And it mentions as well that it's not really secure, but the good thing is you can add .env to your git ignore and it won't be committed to source control, and therefore you won't have things like secrets and those things committed to source control. So now we've got ourselves a new host name because we're going to connect to a different host. So before we were connecting to the MySQL container for database access, and now we want to connect to Postgres, and we've specified the DB environment as Postgres here, and so now we're going to connect to that DB host there. Username, password and database is all the same. Now remember, before we said to ourselves that this schema was created as dev. So if we've made a change here, we can see that we can specify the schema to match the schema that's been created here in our configuration file here. And when we attempt to connect, we'll find that it's throwing an error. So there's something wrong, and at the moment I'm doing a try catch here to catch a specific error or throw a specific exception, but we can get a better look at that, what it's really complaining about, just if I comment out momentarily the exception and see what it throws. So it's saying missing database connection refused. So why would it be saying connection refused? Now we know that we've specified Postgres as the new database server that we want to do, but it's saying MySQL connect, so there's something wrong with our configuration still. So going back to our config directory and having a look in our app file, we can find that the data sources key here and the default database still specifies a driver of MySQL. So what we're going to do here is go back to our app local and paste in our MySQL driver, but this time we need to specify that it's going to be a PostgreSQL driver. Notice that's the full class name there, so you need to pull that in at the top of your class or your file to get that referenced properly. Let's try again, and this time it says invalid value for parameter client encoding. So again we have something wrong with our encoding set for this database connection. And if we have a look in app.php, we again find here it says, well, this is for Maria or MySQL. And so if we just comment this out, and we now have a working Postgres connection. Now that appears to have been quite successful, and many of the default views will be fine. Everything just seems to work pretty well, and especially your index pages and those sorts of things. But in other cases where you've created custom queries, you start to notice these error messages here. So data mismatches, and it's saying argument of OR must be type Boolean, not type integer. And so then you need to start chasing down the particular problems that you're encountering to be able to fix these issues. So let's do an example. So here we find that we're connecting to the palettes controller, and it's the default for that. So we can find out what's being called if we go bin cake routes or routes, and then just have a look at what that specific route is specified as. So it's not the default index view normally. So we need to look for this on-hand method in the palettes controller, and open palettes controller. Let's find on-hand, and here we have it. And in this particular case, I'm deferring the creation of my database query into the palettes table. I'm just going to click on that to find it, and we're specifying a contain array here, and then it's specifying fields that we're going to request from the database. There's a few other things that we're adding as we make choices in the GUI so that we can customize what products are returned. But ultimately it's saying, well, to give me a list of palettes for that on-hand palettes view, we just want to, we've got this options array here. So where is that options array being generated? It's this get view options method here. So what it's doing, it's calling a specific method here to get a number to then bitwise and across the inventory statuses to make sure that we're selecting only inventory that we want to appear in the view. So in this particular case, it's saying, well, this needs to work out to be a true or a false or Boolean value, and it's not. So inventory is null is going to be a Boolean return, but this is actually doing a bitwise and. So for example, it would be the perms would be, maybe number 1, and then it's anding to something else, and that works out to be another value other than a Boolean value. So we need to make sure that this becomes a Boolean value. So how do we do that? Well, we need to start modifying it so that the Postgres commands work. So here we can say, okay, we're going to cast it and as a Boolean and see if that works. It's going back to our error message in the database. So it's saying, okay, so now we've fixed one error, but now it's changed. It's saying undefined column. Column does not exist, line 1. So there's something wrong there, and it seems to be related to this concat statement here. So I'm just going to go back to here and search for where this concat statement is being raised, and this is a real interesting one. So it's basically doing a MySQL function here to concatenate a number of different values together and then a count there. So, but bear with me as I just make one simple change here to my code here, and I don't know why this works, but it has something to do with how the Postgres server accepts its arguments or something, the quoting of the arguments. But I've just changed the single quotes to double quotes and the double quotes to single quotes. Let's have a look at it now and see what it does. And now it's saying, okay, so grouping error, this time with MySQL, I had a different setting in the database. So we can go look at that. It's saying there's a group by error, but my MySQL configuration, if we have a look at config MySQL here, we can see that I had turned off group by. So it basically would allow me to specify a single field for group by, but Postgres doesn't support that. So now we're going to go in and make a change to our group statement here. So it's saying grouping error, palettes item must appear in the group by clause. So I'm just going to copy that, and I know for some reason it's lowercased that, but we're going to just change that back to there and then reload. And then the same thing for palettes description. So we notice that it works, and just for consistency, single quotes, try again. And now we can see that we've now gotten our custom query working with just a few small changes to the Postgres setup in the code. Notice here, this was this concatenation statement. So this was here. So just showing it there. Notice that this concatenating the item, the description, and then giving us a count of palettes on the database there. So there we have it. Now, what you'll have to do with this Postgres setup is basically go through all the different things and do the same. So this one's a location usage report. Again, it's saying there's undefined columns, and yeah, really starting to say, well, there's something wrong there. So it's creating a problem. So let's have a look at that one. And right, so here it's, if we have a look down through here, we may be able to find the, right, so it's looking in the locations controller, location usage report, and it's something in there. So let's go and find it. So locations controller, and we're looking for location usage report. And again, I've got some view options being set here, but I'm actually creating a query in my locations table. So let's go and have a look at that. And some reason I've got a whole heap of old code here that's going to distract us. Now what's the error message again? It's saying that pallet's location ID does not exist. So these seem reasonably correct because they're just default, very default sort of cake things. So let's keep scrolling until I'll delete this code that doesn't make any sense there. And notice here that we've got a saying palett's location ID. If we go back to it here, this used to work with MySQL, does not exist. So we need to figure out how to fix that. And again, let's have a look. So there's P2 dot, now I'm just going to quote that now, and notice if we don't, I've just made a change there, and so it's still complaining, but notice what happens when I make a change here. Right, so now it's complaining about something else. It's saying palett's ID does not exist. So going back into here, we're looking for palett's ID, and we can see palett's ID specified in two places here. So I'm going to just put quotes around that as well, and try again. Now it's still saying something's wrong because we haven't done both, so let's do that one. And now you can see that that works. Now again, you'll have to chase all the particular issues here. So we've got a problem there, and again we just need to change that out for a thing that works. Try again. Alright, so you can really see the process. It's just go to every view and create a, find every single view and find the errors, and then systematically work through the errors. So again, we're seeing in the same place. Let's have a look down through. So it's view, pallets, cartons, and we can see that we're just going to have to continue through and make these changes as they're needed. So let me have a look again. View pallets, cartons, view part pallets, cartons. So let's see. View part pallets, cartons. We're getting a number back from there. Then we're constructing a settings here. So alright, so again we can see that this is going to be returning a number when it shouldn't. So let's see if that fixes the problem. Yep, so is that the only option there? So let's see if that, okay, palettes, cast, inventory status, perms, view perms as a boolean. Okay, is that undefined function? Operator doesn't exist. Okay, it's saying shipment is null or shipment shipped equals 0. So let's have a look at that. Shipments. Okay, so that might be, let's make a change here. Maybe this is going to fix it. Don't know. It seems to have a problem with that one as well. Let's see if this works again. Okay, so again, we're now struggling with a grouping error. So going back to our grouping in this same function, so it's saying group, so we've found grouping here, and we want to specify, I think it'll have to be capitals there, and okay, again we want to just specify for some reason it returns us a lowercase version there, but it's okay to specify the alias, and we do this one again, and noticing that our inventory statuses needs to be CakePHP, and then okay, we might just maybe just shipments shipped. You can really see how it's just a matter of going through every clause and working through the problems. And we can see that I've got code here. Notice this is not working either. So it seems that pretty much everything works like it should, and so much of it works pretty well. But now there's a little bit of an issue here. If we go back to here and we're saying 6.8, so we know this is a, let's search for an item code that we know. Notice that it works, so that's good. So this is a little bit of, if you have a look in the background here, it's a little bit of some JavaScript running in the background to make a call. So if we just have a look there, it's an item lookup, and it's, so you might have to go through all your application and just make sure that all the little bits and pieces work with Postgres. Now there is a huge bug at the moment, and we're just going to generate that bug by creating a new item. So just to demonstrate the problem, I'm going to copy an old item and OFBN12 test, and we've got to put a valid barcode in and a valid consumer unit. And now notice what's happened here. It's saying that the null value in column ID of relation items violates not null constraint. So what it's doing, it's inserting a null value into the ID column and then blowing up. Now the reason for that is, if we have a look at our items column within MySQL, we can see that the ID column is a primary key, not null, and it's auto incrementing. But if we go into Postgres and scroll to our tables and have a look at our items table, what we notice when we look at the properties is that the column definition from ID has successfully pulled across integer, not null, primary key, but there's no configuration for auto-incrementing. Now, if you were creating a column using using this, you would just come in here and say, okay, I want it to be a PQRS. You'd want it to be a serial column. Again, it'd be not null, and let's call it yes. It'll be primary key as well, which we can't do because it's already got a primary key. But if you were creating that column, you would be creating it as a serial column. Notice what it's done here to create the serial column. It's basically inserted, and we just have a look at that by pasting it in here. It's inserted a sequence to generate the auto incrementation. So we now have to go through all our database tables and generate a sequence for them. So let's do that. How do we do that? Well, we need to create a migration within our database. So going into CakePHP, we've got, this is from an old system that's been done a lot of different migrations in, but let's create a migration. So bin cake migrations create and add auto increment to ID. So we're creating a migration here, and what we need to do is we need to somehow specify that we want to modify all these Postgres table ID fields. So how do we do that? Well, we get hold of our migrations and our database, sorry. So I'm going to just copy some code in here and just talk you through it so that it doesn't take forever. So what we've got here is we're getting a connection to the default database. We're getting a collection and then getting a list of tables. And then with those tables, we're just going to loop through the tables and avoid the Finks log table because that's not needing to be modified. Then we're going to say, okay, let's just do a query to find out the maximum value of the ID field in each table at the moment. Then add 1 to it so we can make that as the next number, and then check if there's an ID column, then we'd want to modify it. Now you could search for all auto-incrementing columns that have that specification, and you could do maybe do a, with each table you could get the schema and check, but I'm relatively certain that the only auto-incrementing tables in my database are ID columns. So once I know that there's an ID column in the table, looping through all of them, I just create a sequence with the table name underscore ID underscore sequence and a start value of the very next number it should have. And then I call execute to alter the table and add that sequence in to that table. So let's go in here and firstly we might just delete our column here that we created, so we don't need that. Go yes, save our database, Now we have a look at our sequences, and we just refresh, and it doesn't look like it's got any in there at the moment. And now run our migration. So bin cake migration status, and let's now migrate. Now what will that have done? Let's have a look inside our database again. It's now created a sequence for every ID column in each table, and now if we have a look at our items table as before, we can see that it's assigned our default value as being the next value in that sequence. So that really helps with our migration now. Let's go back and might just try and add a new column. I'm going to need to specify these values: description, my test description, and now you can see that here it is. If we have a look, it now has a value of 18 as the ID for that new record. So we've now fixed one of the issues with the migration using PGLoader. So this hasn't been an exhaustive look at things. There's probably a lot of different things within this transfer that you would want to make changes with, and really ultimately it's just a matter of going into every view and try and fix the errors that you'd have, and you'd need to be really careful to click on absolutely everything in your application, or maybe create tests to make sure that the Postgres transfer had been successful. So I hope this has been useful.